Story 1. The Negatee Lake Disappearance. There is a specific kind of silence that exists only in the Alaskan interior. Not the quiet of a library or the hush of a sleeping house. This is something older, something that has weight to it, like a held breath that the land has been exhaling for 10,000 years. Hunters and bush pilots talk about it sometimes, usually around fires, usually after a few drinks. They don't have a name for it. They just call it the feeling. The feeling that something out there knows you are small. The feeling that something out there is watching you be small. Most men who spend enough time in the Alaskan wilderness encounter it once or twice and decide, quietly and without fuss, that they will not be going back past a certain tree line again. Most men make that decision and get to live with it. Dennis Harlow, Carl Pettit, Marcus Webb, and Roy Sutter did not get that luxury. The four of them had been hunting together for 11 years by October of 2003. Friends from Fairbanks, all of them in their late 40s, all of them the type of men who preferred the company of spruce trees to office walls. They were experienced. That matters here because what happened to them cannot be explained by inexperience. These were not tourists who wandered off a trail. These were men who had navigated remote Alaska in conditions that would break most people. Sir, Marcus Webb had once spent 3 nights alone in the bush after a snowmobile broke down, surviving on emergency rations and sheer stubbornness. Roy Sutter was a licensed guide. Carl Pettit had logged over 2,000 hours in small aircraft. Dennis Harlow had been hunting the Alaskan interior since he was 19 years old. And still, Negatee Lake took them. The plan was simple. Charter a float plane into a remote lake basin roughly 230 miles northeast of Fairbanks, set up camp, spend 10 days hunting elk, and fly back out. The pilot, a man named Gordon Reese, dropped them off on the morning of October 4th and agreed to return on the 14th. He watched the 4 men unload their gear onto the lakeshore, gave them a wave from the cockpit window, and lifted off. That was the last confirmed sighting of all 4 men together, alive and intact. Gordon Reese described the departure as completely normal. The men were in good spirits, joking with each other, or well-equipped, confident. The weather was clear. The lake was calm. There was nothing in that scene, not a shadow out of place, not an uncomfortable pause, not a single thing, to suggest that within 9 days, 3 of those 4 men would cease to exist anywhere that the living world could find them. On October 12th, 2 days before the scheduled pickup, Gordon received a broken transmission on his radio. It was faint, shredded by static, but he could make out a voice he believed to be Dennis Harlow's, repeating something over and over. He caught only fragments, the word stop, the word don't, and what might have been the word trees. Then the signal died completely. Gordon attempted to re-establish contact for 40 minutes. He got nothing. He called in a concern to the Alaska State Troopers and asked whether he should fly out early. The troopers told him to wait until the 14th, and if the men didn't appear at the pickup point, they would formally open a missing persons investigation. Gordon Reese didn't wait. He flew out on the morning of the 13th, alone, without telling anyone where he was going until he was already in the air. What he found at Negatee Lake is something he has described only twice in the 2 decades since, and both times he stopped mid-sentence before the story was finished. As if he had reached a door in his memory, he simply refused to open again. The camp was standing. All 4 tents were upright and staked down. The cooking area was arranged neatly. Dry goods were stacked and sealed in a weather bag. Personal gear, boots, extra clothing, ammunition boxes, sat in place as if the men had simply stepped outside for a moment and intended to return for breakfast. A metal camp pot rested on the portable grate. The coals beneath it were cold. There was no blood, no sign of struggle, no tracks leading away from camp in what should have been soft or readable October ground. The boats were still tied to the shore. The emergency flare kit had not been opened. The satellite phone Roy Sutter had purchased for emergencies, a device he brought on every remote trip and had used reliably for 3 years, sat inside his tent, fully charged, with no outgoing calls in the log. Not one. Not even an attempted call. Whatever happened to those men, there had been no moment where any of them reached for that phone. Gordon called out their names. He walked the full perimeter of camp, his voice swallowed by the trees 30 feet in every direction. The Alaskan interior gave nothing back. A full search and rescue operation was launched within 24 hours. 41 personnel, 2 helicopters, and 3 ground teams worked the area around Negatee Lake for 9 days. On the 8th day, in a birch clearing 6 miles northeast of camp, they found Roy Sutter. He was alive, seated at the base of a tree, alive. He was not hypothermic, in which the attending medic called medically remarkable given overnight temperatures that had dropped to 19 degrees Fahrenheit. He was not dehydrated. He had no physical injuries whatsoever. He had no food on his person, no weapon, and no equipment, though all of those things remained untouched back at camp. He was sitting with his knees drawn to his chest and his eyes wide open, fixed on a point in the middle distance that no one else in that clearing could identify. He did not respond to voices. He did not respond to his name. A rescue worker who arrived first on scene was careful in his later statement to say that Roy's expression was not blank. That distinction clearly mattered to the man, not blank. He said it looked like Roy was still watching something, still tracking something, that existed just beyond the edge of what anyone else could perceive. Roy Sutter was airlifted to Fairbanks Memorial Hospital. He did not speak for 11 days. When he finally did begin to communicate, it was in fragments, incomplete sentences, disconnected images. He said the word wrong many times. He said that whatever came out of the tree line on the second night was not an animal, and that he knew it was not an animal the moment he saw it because of the way it moved. He said it moved like something that had learned to move by watching things that move. He said the others ran. He said he could not explain why he himself did not run, and only that something in him understood, at a cellular level, that running would be the last thing he ever did. He said, "It let me go. I don't know why it let me go. I have thought about that every day since, and I still don't know." Dennis Harlow, Carl Pettit, and Marcus Webb were never found. No remains, no personal effects displaced from camp, no physical evidence of any kind beyond the camp itself, sitting perfect and untouched on that lakeshore like a stage set after the actors have gone home. The Alaska State Troopers officially listed the case as 3 persons missing, presumed dead, cause unknown. Wildlife officials conducted their own assessment and found no evidence of bear activity, no tracks of any large predator, nothing that their experience or their equipment could identify as a credible explanation. Roy Sutter moved out of Alaska within a year of the incident. He settled in a small town in Oregon. He does not hunt. He does not camp. People who know him describe him as a man who always sits with his back to a wall and his eyes on the door. His wife, in a single interview she gave to a regional newspaper in 2009, said that he still sometimes wakes up at 3 in the morning and stands at their bedroom window for hours, looking out at the tree line on the edge of their property. She said she stopped asking him what he was looking at because the answer was always the same. "I'm making sure it didn't follow me." To this day, no authority, no expert, and no investigation has produced a single credible explanation for what happened to 3 experienced Alaskan hunters at Negatee Lake in October 2003. The case file sits in a drawer somewhere in Fairbanks. Roy Sutter is still alive as far as anyone knows, and somewhere in the Alaskan interior, 230 miles northeast of a city that most people will never visit, there is a lake that the local bush pilots have quietly stopped landing on. And nobody made that decision officially. Nobody sent out a memo. They simply looked at the coordinates one day and, one by one, chose a different route. The feeling, after all, is never wrong. Story 2. The Alaska Triangle. Before we talk about what disappears inside the Alaska Triangle, we need to talk about the numbers. Because the numbers are where this story starts. And the numbers are what keeps it from being dismissed as folklore, rumor, or the overactive imagination of people who spend too much time staring at empty maps. Numbers don't have imaginations. Numbers don't embellish. Numbers simply sit there and refuse to be explained away, and the numbers surrounding a specific region of Alaskan wilderness are, by any rational measure, deeply and profoundly wrong. The United States averages roughly 1 missing persons case per 600 square miles of wilderness per year. It is an imperfect metric, but it is the standard used by the FBI, by state agencies, and by the National Park Service when they evaluate search and rescue needs across the country. 1 per 600 square miles. Hold that number in your mind. In the region defined by drawing lines between the cities of Juneau, Anchorage, and Barrow, a vast, largely roadless triangle of tundra, mountain range, and boreal forest sitting in the interior and southeastern portions of the state, the rate is not 1 per 600 square miles. It is not twice that. The rate inside what researchers and investigators have quietly come to call the Alaska Triangle is so far outside the national average that the comparison barely functions as a comparison at all. Since official records began being kept in the mid-20th century, more than 16,000 people have vanished inside this region. 16,000. Gone. No bodies recovered, no wreckage found, no trails, no explanations. The national average would predict approximately 3,000 disappearances over the same period in geography. That leaves 13,000 people with nowhere to go in the math. The story that most people use as a doorway into the Alaska Triangle is the 1972 disappearance of a small Cessna 310 aircraft carrying House Majority Leader Hale Boggs and 3 other men on a flight from Anchorage to Juneau. This was not a private hobbyist in a crop duster. This was a congressional leader traveling in a registered aircraft with an experienced pilot, on a clear weather route in communication with air traffic control. The plane entered the triangle. The plane did not come out. The United States military launched one of the largest search operations in Alaskan aviation history, 40 aircraft covering 100,000 square miles of search area. They found not one piece of the plane, not a seat cushion, not a fuel slick, not a fragment of aluminum, nothing. 4 people in a twin-engine aircraft ceased to exist somewhere over that landscape, and the official conclusion to this day is simply unknown. What makes the Alaska Triangle different from other regions with elevated disappearance rates is not just the scale of the phenomenon. It is the consistency, the pattern. Investigators who have studied the data notice that the disappearances cluster not just within the triangular boundary, but within specific corridors inside it, as if whatever force or factor is responsible has a geography of its own, a preferred territory that it does not stray far from. Experienced pilots who fly the region regularly will tell you off the record and only after you've bought them a second drink that there are valleys they don't fly over, routes they don't take, not because of weather, not because of terrain, but because of a feeling. There is that word again. A feeling that something below is paying attention to them in a way that nothing on the ground should be capable of. The Tlingit people, who have inhabited southeastern Alaska for thousands of years, do not find any of this surprising. Their oral tradition contains extensive accounts of a creature they call the Kushtaka, a shape-shifting entity that is part human, part otter, and entirely malevolent. The Kushtaka is not described as a monster in the Western sense, not a thing that attacks with claws and fury. It is described as a deceiver, a lure. It is said to take the form of a person's loved one, a wife, a child, a brother, and to call out to travelers in the wilderness in that loved one's voice, drawing them off course, deeper into the forest, further from the path, until the traveler is so lost that they can never find their way back. The Tlingit do not treat these accounts as mythology. They treat them as warnings. There is a difference. In 2004, a bush pilot named Alan Thorpe was flying a routine supply run through the Central Triangle when he received a transmission on his radio. The voice on the other end of that transmission was his mother's voice. His mother had died 3 years earlier. He knew this. He sat in the cockpit at altitude and listened to her voice giving him coordinates, a specific set of numbers directing him to change course and fly northeast, deeper into the interior, away from his destination and away from any settlement or landing strip that existed on his charts. He reported afterward that the voice was perfect, not like a recording, not distorted or wrong in any way that his ear could detect. His mother's voice, her cadence, the specific way she said his name. He said that his hand was on the navigation dial. He said he began to turn it. His co-pilot, who had heard nothing, who had been listening to the same radio channel and heard only static, looked over and physically grabbed Thorpe's wrist. Thorpe snapped out of whatever state he had been in, pulled back on course. They landed safely at their destination 40 minutes later. Thorpe filed a report with the FAA. The FAA logged it under Pilot Anomalous Experience and closed the file within a week. What the official record does not contain is what Thorpe told friends in the years after. He said that after they landed, he sat in the cockpit alone for a long time while his co-pilot unloaded the cargo. He said he tried to reason through what had happened, to find the rational explanation, and to put it in a box he could close and carry. And then he said something that has never left the people who heard it. He said that the reason he had started to turn the dial, the reason his hand had moved toward those coordinates, was not because the voice had fooled him into thinking his mother was alive. He knew she was dead. He knew it the entire time he was listening. He turned the dial because whatever was speaking to him in her voice was so accurate, so perfectly her, that some part of him decided it didn't matter anymore, that whatever was waiting at those coordinates was worth flying toward even knowing what it was. He never flew the triangle route again. He transferred his license to a commercial airline and spent the rest of his career flying domestic routes between cities. His co-pilot, a younger man named Davis, quit aviation entirely within 6 months. He has never publicly explained why. The Alaska Triangle remains one of the most statistically anomalous geographic regions in the world when measured by disappearance rate. No government agency has formally studied it as a unified phenomenon. No university research program has been funded to investigate it. The data sits in separate filing systems: aviation incident reports, state trooper missing persons cases, park service records, never compiled, never analyzed as a pattern, and never addressed as the single coherent mystery that it is. Whether that's because there is no credible explanation, or because someone, somewhere, has decided the public does not need to have one, is a question that nobody in an official position has ever been willing to answer. 16,000 people, 13,000 of them with nowhere to go in the math. Whatever is inside that triangle, it is not running low on room. Story 3. The Cabin on the Hall Road. If you have never driven the Dalton Highway, let me paint it for you, because the geography of this story is the story. The Dalton Highway, known to truckers as the Hall Road, stretches 414 miles north from Fairbanks to the oil fields at Prudhoe Bay, running along the spine of Alaska through terrain so remote, so devoid of human presence, that there are stretches where your nearest neighbor is not a town or a rest stop or even a road sign, but a mountain, a literal mountain, immovable, indifferent, and looking down at you with the same patience it has been practicing for 3 million years. There are no towns on the Dalton Highway. Not one. There are 2 facilities where a trucker can stop and get fuel and a meal: Coldfoot Camp at mile 175 and Dead Horse at the very end of the road. And between those 2 points, 239 miles of Arctic wilderness pass without a single permanent human settlement. Cell service does not exist for most of the route. In January, temperatures routinely drop to -40, -50 Fahrenheit. If a rig breaks down in those conditions and no other truck comes along, the driver has a few hours before the cold becomes a medical problem, and a few more before the cold becomes the last problem they will ever have. And this is the road where Travis Cole had his encounter in January of 2009. Travis was a Fairbanks-based long-haul trucker who had been running the Hall Road for 6 years. He knew the road the way a musician knows a song, not just the melody, but the underneath of it, the hard parts, the places where it could turn on you if you let your attention slip. He was not a man given to fancy or fear. His words, from an account he gave to a small Alaska trucking community forum in 2011, and has since confirmed in person to several people who sought him out. I am not the kind of guy who tells ghost stories. I am not the kind of guy who has ghost stories to tell. I'm telling this because it is what happened and I cannot explain it, and I need someone else to try. He was northbound at approximately 2:15 in the morning, somewhere around mile 260, deep in the stretch between Coldfoot and Dead Horse, the deadest part of the dead road, when his rig developed a fuel line problem and he was forced to pull over. Outside temperature was -42. He had emergency gear, he had blankets, he had a CB radio, but CB coverage in that region is unreliable at best, and he was not getting a signal. He tried for 20 minutes. He got nothing but static and the occasional distant fragment of another driver's voice too far away to read clearly. And then he looked out his passenger side window and saw the light. It was coming from a structure set back from the road, maybe 200 yards into the trees, barely visible through the spruce. A warm yellow light, the kind that comes from a window with a fire behind it. Travis sat in his cab and looked at that light for a long time. He was not naive. He knew that a structure 200 yards off the Dalton Highway at mile 260 was deeply unusual. There were no registered dwellings in that area. No hunting cabins on any map he had ever consulted. No reason for a building to be there. But the light was there, yellow and warm, and it was -42 outside, and his fuel line wasn't going to fix itself. He layered up, climbed down from the cab, and walked through the snow toward the light. The cabin was small, old, built from rough-hewn logs in a style that suggested it had been standing for decades rather than years. Smoke came from a stone chimney. The single window glowed. Travis knocked on the door. He heard nothing from inside for a long moment, long enough that he began to wonder if the structure was abandoned and the light was somehow residual, some trick of the fire dying in an empty hearth. And then the door opened. The man standing in the doorway was tall, thin, pale in the way that people who spend little time in sunlight become pale. He was wearing no coat, no outer layer of any kind, despite the fact that he had just opened a door onto -42-degree air. A flannel shirt, work pants, no hat. He was smiling at Travis in the manner of a man who had been expecting company and was pleased that it had finally arrived. Travis described the smile as friendly. He also described it in the same breath as deeply wrong, though he struggled for years to articulate why. Something about the proportion of it, something about the timing. It appeared too quickly, fully formed, as if it had been practiced rather than felt. The man invited him in without waiting to be asked. Travis entered. The cabin interior was warm, fireplace burning strong, a wooden table and 2 chairs at the center, an iron stove against one wall. Basic, sparse, functional. And then Travis's eyes moved to the walls, and his brain took several seconds to process what he was looking at, because it was so far outside what he had expected to find that his mind initially refused to categorize it. Photographs, hundreds of them. Polaroid photographs, pinned in tight rows from floor to ceiling on every available wall surface, overlapping at the edges, covering the log walls so completely that in places the wood was not visible at all. And every single photograph was a picture of a vehicle stopped on the Dalton Highway. Trucks, mostly. A few SUVs shot from a distance, shot in darkness, shot in the flat gray light of overcast Arctic days. Trucks parked on the gravel shoulder with their hazard lights on. Trucks with hoods raised. Trucks sitting silent and still in what looked like middle-of-the-night conditions with no lights on at all, as if the driver had simply stopped and did not intend to start again. Travis stood in the middle of that cabin and scanned the walls. His mind was doing something very fast and quiet that he wouldn't fully understand until later. It was counting. Not a precise count, but a sense of scale. There were dozens of photographs, maybe more than 100. He looked at the closest cluster to him, and he saw that the photos were dated. Handwritten dates in the white border at the bottom of each Polaroid in the same precise, unhurried handwriting. He looked at the dates on the nearest row. The most recent was from 9 days ago. He looked at the man. The man was still smiling, standing by the fireplace, watching Travis look at the walls the way a museum curator might watch a visitor discover a favorite exhibit. He said nothing. He made no move to explain. He simply waited. Travis said he needed to get back to his truck to check something. He said it conversationally, evenly, proud of himself later for how steady his voice had been. The man nodded once, that same too-practiced nod, and Travis walked back out through the door and across the 200 yards of snow without running, and without looking back, without making a sound until he was inside his cab with the door locked and his CB radio in his hand. He eventually reached another trucker 30 miles south who relayed his fuel situation to Coldfoot. A service truck reached him at dawn. When Travis told the service crew about the cabin in the trees, 2 of them drove out on a snowmobile to check. They came back quiet. One of them, a man who had been working that stretch of the Hall Road for over a decade, who told Travis that there had never been a structure registered in that area, to his knowledge. He said that, and then he said something else. He said that there had been rumors over the years from other drivers. Rumors about a light in the trees near that mile marker, always the same stretch, always at night, always in winter. The authorities were notified. A formal check of the area was conducted 3 days later, when weather permitted ground access off-road. They found the site, but the cabin foundation was visible. Old stone and timber, collapsed and charred, fire damage assessed by a structural assessor as being at least 15 to 20 years old. The structure had burned down, the assessor said. Whatever had been standing there had not been standing for a very long time. The photographs were never explained. The man in the flannel shirt was never identified. The trucks on those cabin walls, all those silent, stopped vehicles on all those dark nights on the loneliest road in America, were never accounted for. Travis Cole still drives long haul, but his current routes are all in the lower 48. He has not been back to Alaska since 2009. He will tell you, if you ask him directly, that it is not the cabin that keeps him away. It is the photographs. Specifically, it is one thing about the photographs that he noticed only later, sitting in his truck in the gray dawn waiting for the service crew, turning the details over in the silence of his cab. In every single photograph he saw, every one of those stopped trucks on every one of those dark nights, there were no drivers visible. The vehicles were there, the road was there, the darkness was there. But if a driver had gotten out to look under the hood or flag someone down, there was no sign of them, not a silhouette. Not a shadow, not a single human figure anywhere in any frame. Just the trucks, alone. The way they look when whoever was inside them isn't coming back. Story 4. The Woman in the Water. Hyder, Alaska. There are towns in Alaska that feel like the edge of the world. And then there is Hyder. To reach Hyder, Alaska, population at last reasonable count, somewhere between 80 and 100 people, depending on the season and the mood of the residents. You cannot drive through Alaska at all. The only road access to Hyder comes through Stewart, British Columbia, on the Canadian side of the border. You cross an international boundary to reach an American town. You enter the United States from Canada with no customs stop, no border agent, no checkpoint of any kind. Because the U.S. Customs Service abandoned its Hyder post in 1971 and never saw the need to return. The town is geographically American and functionally alone. A small cluster of buildings at the end of a fjord, surrounded by glacier-carved mountains that catch the cloud cover and hold it so that Hyder exists in a near-permanent soft gray light, like a photograph that was taken correctly but printed slightly wrong. The residents of Hyder call it the friendliest ghost town in Alaska. They put that phrase on a sign. They are proud of it. What the sign does not mention, what the residents discuss in quieter registers and with more careful faces, is the Bear River, specifically what has been seen standing in the Bear River after dark. The sightings, as far as anyone can document them with precision, began in the autumn of 1997. A young girl, 7 years old, the daughter of one of the town's few year-round families, told her mother over dinner one evening that there was a woman standing in the river at night. She had seen her twice from her bedroom window, she said, standing in the deep middle of the river, facing upstream, perfectly still. The mother asked what the woman looked like. The girl said she was very tall. She said her hair was long and dark and covered her face. She said the woman never moved, not even when the current pressed against her legs, and that the river came up to the woman's waist, and this seemed not to bother her at all. The mother checked the window. The window faced the river. She could see in daylight the exact stretch of water her daughter was describing. She told the girl it had probably been a shadow, or a piece of driftwood in an unusual configuration, or the mind doing what young minds do when they stare out windows at dark water late at night. The girl considered this and said, "She waved at me once. I waved back." 3 weeks later, another child in town, a 9-year-old boy named Peter, no relation to the first family, told his father the same thing. He described the same figure in almost identical terms: tall, dark hair over the face, standing midstream, perfectly still, facing upriver. He added a detail the first child hadn't mentioned. He said the woman's dress was wrong for the weather. It was October in Hyder, and the river temperature would have been just above freezing. The woman he described appeared to be wearing something thin, light, unsuited to cold. He said she did not shiver. The parents spoke to each other. They decided to keep the matter quiet, not wanting to upset either child or establish a community narrative that might amplify itself into something unmanageable. Children, they reasoned. Overactive imaginations. The river at night from an upstairs window. It was nothing. Then Marcus Ellery saw her. Marcus was 44 years old, a contract logger who had been working the timber operations near Hyder for 3 seasons. He was not a man who spent time on children's stories. He was driving back to his rental accommodation along the river road at approximately 11 p.m. on a Tuesday in November when his headlights caught her in the water. He stopped the truck. He sat for a long moment looking at the figure standing in the river in the beam of his headlights. Midstream, the current pressing against her waist, her dark hair down and obscuring her face entirely, before he leaned forward slowly and put his hand on the horn. She did not react to the sound. She did not turn. She did not flinch. She stood the way only a thing that does not startle stands. Marcus drove directly to the home of the town's part-time administrator, knocked on the door at 11:30 at night, and told the man what he had just seen. The following morning, Marcus resigned from his logging contract, packed his gear, and drove out through Stewart and did not return. He gave a single account to a researcher several years later, in which he described what he had seen when the figure in the river slowly, very slowly, in response to nothing the researcher could identify as a stimulus, turned toward the headlights. He would not describe what he saw when the hair fell away from the face. He said only, "It was not what a face does." And then he ended the call. The sightings continued through that winter, reported by 4 more adults at various points along the river. And then in February of 1998, a 9-year-old girl named Claire Addison went missing. She was last seen at home at 8 in the evening. Her parents checked on her at 10 and she was gone. The window of her bedroom, which faced the river, was unlatched. There were no tracks in the snow outside the window, no signs of disturbance, no indication of which direction she had gone. The temperature that night was 12 degrees Fahrenheit. Claire was found on the opposite bank of the Bear River, 72 hours later, sitting on a gravel bar in perfect physical health. She was warm. Not dressed for warmth, her clothing was inadequate for the conditions, but her core temperature was normal, her extremities showed no frostbite, and she displayed no physical signs whatsoever of 3 days spent in sub-zero conditions with no food, no shelter, and no crossing point she could have used without going through water cold enough to stop an adult's heart in minutes. She had crossed the river. They never determined how. Claire told her parents, calmly and without distress, that the woman had shown her how to walk on the cold. When pressed, she said the woman had held her hand in the water, and the water had not been cold for her, and that she had walked across while the woman walked beside her, and the water was like walking on a floor. She said the woman had not spoken, not in words. She said she understood what the woman wanted without needing words. When asked what the woman wanted, Claire was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "She was lonely, and she wanted me to see that the river is not what we think it is." After February 1998, the sightings stopped. No adult reported the figure again. No child mentioned seeing her. The river went back to being a river, cold, clear, unremarkable, running through the fjord and out to the sea the same way it had been running since the glaciers that carved the valley finished their work and moved on. Claire Addison grew up in Hyder. She is in her mid-30s now. She is, by all accounts, a quiet and private person who is well regarded in the community. She does not speak about what happened to her in the winter of 1998. She has never given an interview. She has never filed any kind of report or statement with authorities. She goes about her life in that gray fjord light without, as far as anyone can tell, any unusual difficulty. She has a house. She has work she does. She has people who care about her. The one thing that people in Hyder will quietly note, if you know them well enough to ask, is that Claire does not go near the river. She takes the long road around when she needs to cross town. She does not fish, though fishing is one of the primary ways of life in that community. She has not been to the riverbank in any capacity in over 20 years. At first, when she was young, people thought this was a reasonable response to trauma and expected her to move past it with time, the way people move past difficult things with time. She has not moved past it. The river remains the river, and Claire remains on her side of it, and there are people in Hyder who are no longer sure the two things are unrelated. There are people who wonder if whatever came out of the water to collect that little girl on a February night made some kind of arrangement that has never officially expired, who wonder if Claire's distance from the river is not fear, if it might be something else entirely, something more like obligation, something more like a debt that hasn't been fully settled yet. A woman in the water, alone at the center of a river no one else can stand in, waiting for the night she stops waiting. Story 5. The last transmission of Kino 7. Radio in the Alaskan interior is not a convenience. It is a lifeline. Before satellite communication became accessible and affordable, before the cell towers crept northward along the corridors of what few roads exist, radio was often the only thread connecting remote settlements, bush communities, and solo operators to anything resembling the wider human world. A radio station in interior Alaska was not background noise. It was the sound of someone else being alive at the same time you were, somewhere in the same darkness, and that mattered in ways that are difficult to fully articulate to people who have never spent a winter night 100 miles from their nearest neighbor. Kino 7 was a small, volunteer-operated broadcast station serving a remote stretch of interior Alaska approximately 90 miles north of Fairbanks. It had been operating since 1979, run by a rotating group of community volunteers who took shifts broadcasting weather reports, emergency announcements, hunting and trapping advisories, and the occasional music program for the benefit of the scattered residents, bush workers, and Dalton Highway truckers whose reception range overlapped with the station's signal. It was not a professional operation. It was a shed with equipment in it and people who cared enough to show up and press the buttons. That kind of station was the backbone of interior Alaskan communication for decades, and the community that relied on Kino 7 treated it the way you treat anything that keeps you connected to the world when the world has a habit of going very far away. On the evening of October 31st, 1986, the station's scheduled programming ended at 10 p.m., as it always did. The last volunteer locked the shed and drove home. The equipment was powered down. The building was secured with a padlock on the exterior hasp, a padlock that, as would later be confirmed, showed no signs of tampering, no scratches on the cylinder, no damage to the hasp or the surrounding door frame. The shed was locked. The equipment was off. There was nothing inside that building generating a signal. At 3:17 a.m., Kino 7 began broadcasting. A long-haul trucker named Gerald Banks, running a northbound load on the Dalton Highway 61 miles from the station. He had his truck radio open to Kino 7's frequency out of habit, the way drivers in that corridor often did. Partly for weather information, mostly for the comfort of knowing the channel was there. He was the one who caught the broadcast coming on. He was also, as it turned out, a man in the habit of running a portable cassette recorder on long night runs, recording songs off the radio for later. A simple personal habit. And the recorder happened to be running when Kino 7 came back to life in the middle of the night. What he recorded, and what he initially told only his dispatch supervisor about, was a man's voice, not panicked, not excited, flat and precise and calm in the manner of someone reciting information from a list, reading coordinates, latitude and longitude pairs one after another in a steady, unhurried cadence. The voice read, coordinates for 11 minutes without stopping. Yet without commentary, without any other content. Then it stopped. A silence of approximately 40 seconds followed, and then a second voice came on. A child's voice. A young child, Gerald thought, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, impossible to determine gender from the recording, calm in a different way than the first voice, not reciting, talking. And what the child said, in a single clear sentence before the transmission ended permanently, was, "They're already at your door." Gerald Banks pulled his truck to the shoulder of the highway and did not move it for over an hour. When he reported the broadcast the following morning, The Alaska FCC field office in Anchorage initiated an investigation. Personnel traveled to the Keno 7 station, examined the building, and confirmed what should have been impossible. The exterior lock was intact and undamaged. The interior was undisturbed. The equipment, upon technical inspection, showed no indication of having been powered up or operated. The transmission logs, physical tape logs that the station's equipment automatically maintained, showed no activity. And yet the station's frequency had been occupied for 11 minutes at 3:17 a.m., a fact confirmed independently by Gerald Banks's cassette tape and by 2 other receivers in the region who, it was subsequently discovered, had also heard portions of the broadcast and had simply not thought to report it. And Gerald Banks's cassette tape was collected by the FCC as part of their investigation. He was told it would be returned to him after the matter was resolved. It was never returned. The investigation was closed within 3 months with a finding of equipment malfunction. Unexplained equipment activation, attributed to a possible radio frequency anomaly. Gerald pushed back on this conclusion. He was not a technical expert, but he had been listening to radios for 20 years, and he understood, at a basic operational level, that a powered-down transmitter could not broadcast on its own frequency for 11 continuous minutes due to a radio frequency anomaly. The FCC did not respond further. The cassette tape was not returned. Gerald made 1 copy before surrendering it to the investigators, and that copy, according to people who have since spoken to Gerald about this incident, was passed quietly among Dalton Highway truckers for years afterward, traveling on dubs of dubs until the audio quality degraded beyond usefulness. What the FCC investigation did not pursue, and what Gerald Banks spent a significant portion of the next decade pursuing on his own, was the coordinates. The coordinates that the flat, calm voice had spent 11 minutes reading. Gerald had written them down from memory as best he could within an hour of the broadcast, in the truck cab in the dark on the shoulder of the highway, while the child's voice was still reverberating in his chest. He had been careful. He had been thorough. He was not able to reconstruct all of them, but he got most. Over the course of the following 14 months, Gerald tracked what happened at the approximate geographic locations of those coordinates. He was not a private investigator. He had no formal methodology. He read newspapers, listened to CB chatter, asked questions carefully of dispatchers and troopers he knew through the trucking network. He was looking for something. He wasn't sure exactly what. And he found it. And what he found is the part of this story that has never made it into any official document anywhere. At 7 of the coordinate locations he had recorded, a missing persons case was opened within the following 12 months. 7 separate incidents, 7 separate individuals. In 4 of the cases, the missing persons were never found. In 3, the cases were eventually resolved, 2 as accidents, 1 as a medical event. But the resolution came months after the disappearance, and in each case, the investigating officer noted in their paperwork the unusual circumstances under which the person was found or declared deceased, circumstances that Gerald, reading between the lines of incident reports he obtained through contacts, he summarized this way in his own notes. They were somewhere they had no reason to be, doing something that made no sense given who they were and what they knew about the world. Gerald Banks retired from trucking in 1995. He is not a man who presents well in the context of this kind of story. He is not dramatic. He does not lean into the strangeness of what he experienced. He does not perform. He describes things in the flat, even voice of someone who simply observed events and recorded them and has spent 30-plus years being unable to fit those events into any framework that the world offers him. He has said, in conversations with people who have interviewed him informally over the years, that the thing he thinks about most is not the coordinates and not the disappeared and not even the child's voice, though the child's voice is the thing that woke him up for years. The thing he thinks about most is the first voice, the male voice reading the coordinates. Because Gerald Banks is a man who has worked with radios his entire adult life, and he knows what different microphone setups sound like, and he knows what different recording conditions sound like, and the voice on that tape, from the very first second of that broadcast, did not sound like it was coming from inside the Keno 7 shed. It did not have the acoustic signature of a small enclosed wooden structure. It sounded, Gerald has said on more than one occasion, like whoever was speaking was outside, in the open, with nothing around them in any direction. Reading those coordinates into the dark Alaskan night air with the patience of something that had been waiting for a very long time to read them, and was finally, at 3:17 on the morning of October 31st, 1986, being allowed to begin. The Kino 7 station operated for 4 more years before the volunteer pool dried up and the equipment was decommissioned. The building still stands, technically. The frequency it operated on is officially unassigned. If you have a radio sensitive enough and you are far enough north and the conditions are right, some truckers will tell you that on certain quiet nights, particularly in late October, particularly in the early hours before dawn, you can pick up something on that frequency. Not music, not a voice exactly, just a sound, a kind of breathing. Steady and slow, the way something breathes when it is not cold and not afraid, and not in any kind of hurry. The way something breathes when it knows you are listening. The way something breathes when it has somewhere it wants you to go, and all the time in the world to wait until you do. The cassette tape has never officially resurfaced. The FCC file is closed, and somewhere in interior Alaska, on a frequency nobody is supposed to be using, in a building that hasn't housed working equipment in over 30 years, something, on some nights, is still transmitting. If these stories got under your skin the way they got under mine, if you found yourself looking over your shoulder at the tree line, or listening a little more closely to the silence between sounds, then you already know that Alaska is not finished with us. There are hundreds more accounts like these buried in trooper files, trucker forums, and the quiet conversations of people who went north and came back changed. Every week I dig into another one. If you want to be there when I do, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Drop a comment below and tell me which of these 5 kept you awake longest, because I read every single one. And if you know someone who thinks they don't scare easily, share this video with them. Let's find out together. The wilderness keeps its secrets, but we're going to keep asking. Until next time, stay close to the fire, and whatever you do, don't go near the tree line after dark.